But oh, okay. It's nurtured uh, newly by this swaggering how do we say that? Broligarchy that has transformed the state into an instrument of oligarchic rule. That's not new. It's just more extreme. It's a difference of not of kind, but of quantity. Um, the New York Times ran a story yesterday on a handful of billionaires that essentially control the elections. 5 to 1, they donate to Republicans. Again, this is aspirational. It doesn't completely work. We saw some good news in New York City and Virginia and New Jersey, although those are blue states. Um, so there's the oligarchy tech guys have dreams of these libertarian free economic zones. There's the Epstein class and this normal state, if you're a person of color, is just as brutal as the autocratic state. It always has been, in which people are exposed to police violence, arbitrary police violence, etc. So here's the problem with this hybrid dual state. The boundary between the two is porous, and we don't always know which state we're living in. And tragedy happens when you assume that you're living in the normal state, but it turns out you're not. And I think this is a good explanation of what happened to Renee Good and Alex Preddy, for example, who, as white people protesting, assumed up to a point that the normal rules applied. They didn't. That's forgivable and tragic. What's not forgivable is the Democratic Party, which also too often assumes that it's still living in the normal state and behaves that way. We can go into that. And then there's the crossover between the two. And then I'll stop in just a second when I finish this point. You have this, it's easy to forget that Minneapolis all began with the accusation that their Somali population was a bunch of welfare queens, that essentially they were stealing child care funds, publicly funded from the state. And therefore, they were the latest welfare queens, standard neoliberal stuff that goes back to Reagan. So they become welfare frauds, and they are the undeserving Black people stealing from the deserving white people. That's normal. It turns people of color, like the Somalis, into moral outlaws to justify their exclusion. What is the difference, though, is that in the autocratic state, once you've become a moral outlaw, you become a political outlaw, and you are no longer a legitimate member of the whole political community, no longer protected from the police state, and essentially completely vulnerable to police violence, deportability, concentration camps, etc. So you have this kind of slide over from the old normative state of welfare queenism to essentially complete elimination. And the biggest problem is that since so many people live in the normative state, it lulls us into thinking that the other one doesn't exist or isn't that bad. So I'll stop there and let others hopefully be more optimistic.
Thanks, Peggy. So we really had just not a normal presidency. We've had a regime change from the point of view of the White House, and they're attempting to make this change. Bob, how do you see the election of Donald Trump? What do we know about this?
Well, as the designated optimist, let me offer some hope. Excuse me. So if you go back to the founding of the American Constitution, this was a revolt against King George. And if you look at what was on the mind of the people who devised the American Constitution, which is laid out in the Federalist Papers, they were concerned about two things. They were concerned about autocratic power, and also throughout the Federalist Papers, they were concerned about corruption. And Donald Trump epitomizes both. So what did they do? Well, they created separation of powers, checks and balances, Congress, court, executive branch, and also federalism. And they thought that by dividing power and having checks by one branch of government on other branches of government, you could limit corruption and you could make sure we'd never get another king. Now, seemingly, Trump has breached all of that. And I want to argue that at least some of it, some of the checks and balances are still alive and well. Well, they're not well, but they're still alive. And they're in the process of being reactivated. And that is actually containing Trump. And let me give some examples. So seemingly, the courts are in Trump's back pocket. But I think if you look at recent court decisions, both the Supreme Court and certainly the lower courts, the courts have had a belly full of Trump. John Roberts did everything he could to be Trump's stooge. And finally, Trump just went too far. It's one thing to believe in a unitary executive when the executive is a conservative who wants to do away with the New Deal version of regulation, independent regulatory agencies. It's another thing when the executive is barking mad, as our British friends say. And I think Roberts in particular has just decided that this president is out of his mind. And Amy Coney Barrett is also voting with Roberts and the liberals, and you've had some 6-3 votes against Trump, which is just remarkable because two of these 6 people are Trump appointees. And let me give some examples. The president tried to declare a state of emergency and federalize the National Guard and send it to Illinois. And the Supreme Court said, nope, 6-3, can't do that. And Trump pulled the troops out. And it was very clear that this is where Minnesota was going, that he was losing case after case after case in the lower courts in Minnesota. If he hadn't acted to dramatically restrain ICE, the courts would have done it for him. Secondly, in the tariff case, Trump came up with a provision of the tariff law that allows him to declare an economic emergency in cases where there's a chronic balance of payments and then impose tariffs. Well, the problem is if the law justifies imposing tariffs for economic purposes and you suddenly double the tariff on Canada or whoever because the president or prime minister of that country has been insufficiently deferential to you, that's not an economic emergency. And the court, again, Roberts writing a very strong opinion that went further than he needed to do, said, no, you can't do that. This is not an economic emergency. This is presidential petulance. You don't get to do that. And the court also left the door open for $100 and some odd billion worth of refunds. You're going to have a case coming down very soon on Trump's attempt to override birthright citizenship, which is very clearly spelled out in the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. If you are born here, you are a citizen. 14th Amendment says that almost in so many words, and just about everybody who's looked into this believes that the court, probably 6-3, maybe even 7-2, is going to say, sorry, Trump, you can't override birthright citizenship. And the lower courts are even more and more emphatic. The lower courts are just fed up with the administration trying to play them for fools and not following court orders, just in a whole bunch of areas, ranging from federal funding of institutions to summary deportation of people without due process. So very major check and balance. And the other interesting thing here is Trump has not defied the Supreme Court. people were saying, well, what if he doesn't follow the Supreme Court? Well, he is following the Supreme Court. And some of these some of these decisions are self-executing. If the court holds that these tariffs don't apply, people just stop paying the tariffs. So that's a little bit of good news. Secondly, even though the Republican Congress has slavishly tried to be, again, Trump's patsy, there are just enough exceptions to that in a closely divided Congress that some aspect of the check and balance system that the founders of the Constitution intended is still functioning. So if you look at the firing of Kristi Noem, who should have been fired a long time ago, but better late than never, the head of the Department of Homeland Security, this is really triggered by her appalling performance in 2 congressional hearings, and her interrogators were Republicans. The senators who made a fool of Kristi Noem were Republican senators who had just had it with Kristi Noem, and then a day later, Trump fires Noem. And so the Republicans are very, very worried about the electoral fallout from Trump's incredible unpopularity when the election happens in November. Ah, you say, but what makes you think there will be an election in November? What if Trump just cancels the election or just declares a state of emergency and takes over the election? Well, again, thanks to the founders of the Constitution, that's not how it works. The administration of elections was left to the states. And Trump's Justice Department has tried to order states to give over voting rolls so that they could conduct bogus purges. And most states have said, sorry, we're not going to send you voting rolls. And the courts have backed the states. And if you look at recent elections, one after the other, in Republican governed states as well as Democratic governed states, the elections have come off pretty honestly. Texas, just the other day, had a primary. And yeah, they played cute with a rule that you have to vote in one precinct in the primary and another precinct in the general, and that cost Crockett some votes, but it didn't change the outcome. And the guy who the Republicans really didn't want to win, James Talarico, who could probably capture the seat for the Democrats, he won. And if you look at Democratic successes in recent off-year elections in Republican state after Republican state, there was very, very little fiddling with the elections. And so Trump is going to try to do what he can to take over elections, but the courts aren't going to let him do it. And I think the third check and balance is the people. The people who were a little too quiescent in the first several months of Trump's administration really woke up in Minnesota. And I think the people, the citizenry have been activated. One of the things that's going to happen is something called Democracy Summer, inspired by Mississippi Democracy Summer 1964, where students from all over the country are going to become poll watchers and are going to be trained next summer to be poll watchers in November. And it's not going to be that easy to take over the country in the face of an activated citizenry, opposing courts, and some Republicans beginning to defect. Now, that's an optimistic reading. I could be wrong, and then of course we have Iran. We can wait for the second round of comments to talk about Iran, but Iran is not going well for the president. It's not the cakewalk that he thought it would be. It's not Venezuela the second, and that's going to backfire on Trump. So as this is going to be a close call, but I think the American Republic is going to escape unscathed, not unscathed, but able to regenerate itself, and I think that's going to begin with the 2026 election.
Thanks, Bob. Fred, what do we know about the Trump presidency?
Well, I guess I'll try to come somewhere in between these two. I mean that part of the horror is that if Bob is right and the Democrats do well in the midterm elections and regain the presidency, in 2028, they're going to find themselves in the classic fiscal hole of a newly elected government because Trump has just blown out the deficit. The war in Iran is incredibly costly, and they'll have run down their stock of military weapons and so forth. So it can't be exaggerated how much damage is being done. The gutting of the federal bureaucracy, the Centers for Disease Control. There are whole aspects of the federal government that have been weakened that are going to take considerable time to rebuild. But I was going to start by saying that in some ways it's a mistake to have a panel of social scientists evaluating this question. What we really need is a panel of psychoanalysts because Trump is a crazy person. I mean, that as Bob pointed out, that the level of psychological dysfunction cannot be exaggerated, and that produces a kind of systematic incompetence, that operates across the whole administration. So Peggy is completely right that at the core there is a authoritarian project, but it is an authoritarian project which was being carried out by a bunch of totally incompetent people with an incorrect theory of how you do it, because that from the beginning they were operating with the theory that the way in which you impose authoritarianism is that you flood the zone, that you go after everybody at the same time. You have so many different initiatives that you keep everybody off balance and they can't do anything. But the but remember the kind of Pastor Niemöller, first they came for the Jews, I did nothing, then they came for the trade unionists, and when they came for me, there was nobody. Well, the whole point of that is that classic authoritarians, successful authoritarians, stage the attacks on their enemies. And that what the Trump administration did from the first day was that they went after everybody at the same time as part of the flood the zone strategy. So that when Elon Musk and Doge were running amok in across the federal government, they were threatening the Veterans Administration. Now, if you're a rational authoritarian, the veterans, are one of your core constituencies, and you try to hold on to them and you don't attack them. Similarly, they attack Social Security. So that incompetence cannot be exaggerated. The and it is related to the point that Bob made about the court's holding, that one of the things that Trump or his defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, demanded that that the Justice Department go after a bunch of Congress people who had made a public service ad telling the soldiers that they didn't have to follow illegal orders, which is part of military doctrine. I mean, that the soldiers themselves are told by their officers that you don't have to follow illegal orders. But Trump and Hegseth were furious, and they sicked the Justice Department on these people. And so a case was taken to a grand jury. The joke about grand juries in the US is that you could indict a ham sandwich. I mean, that grand juries just get one side of the story, that they're very easy to manipulate. So they went before a grand jury to indict these Congress people for whatever and they did not get a single vote in the grand jury. That the grand jury was unanimous in opposing this. So this is a kind of feature of the incompetence, that you cannot engage in an authoritarian project when you can't get the court system to convict your enemies, and they have consistently failed at doing that. Now, I want to make two other points that Peggy talked about the racism, the attack on Black and brown people, and obviously the an extremely destructive deportation campaign. But one of the contradictions is that at the same time that this administration is picking people who've been in the country for 20, 30 years off the street and quickly sending them to detention camps and then to another country, they have significantly increased the temporary worker programs, both for technical workers, scientists, engineers, software people, and for agricultural workers. And so if you look at the figures for last year, the number of temporary workers who are mostly brown people, who they are bringing in is pretty much equal to the number of brown people that they're deporting. So they haven't been able, in other words, that this is being done, under a racist ideology, which we need to get purge the country of immigrants, but their compromise with the business community, which needs immigrant workers, is that they're bringing in a comparable number of brown people, but brown people who have no rights whatsoever, because under the temporary worker programs, that the minute you say, hey, you didn't pay me my wages this week, they can ship you back out of the country. So that even in terms of their racist project, they're not able to be ideologically consistent, again, reflecting that they're constrained by the needs of the business community. So the last thing that I'll say is that the proper way to understand Venezuela and Iran is that Trump has hit a wall domestically. There's nothing he can get through Congress at this point because the Republican margins are so small. The deportation campaign that he was essentially defeated in Minneapolis, the restraint on using the military was another major defeat. And one thing which hasn't been mentioned is that a part of the authoritarian scenario was that the Immigration and Customs Enforcement has a project of building detention centers all across the country, that they're literally trying to buy up large warehouses, already existing warehouses, that they're going to subdivide into little prison cells, and that they have a plan to create literally hundreds of thousands of containments, all of which was that the government would buy up the warehouses and then they would subcontract them to these private contractors who run these prison facilities, these concentration camps, very cheaply by practically offering no food whatsoever, just horrible, horrible conditions. And what's been happening is that in communities all across the country, in red states, in red districts, in blue districts, and so forth, local people are mobilizing to stop these transactions from taking place. They're putting pressure on the owners of the warehouses not to turn them over to ICE. They're mobilizing local governments and so forth. Okay, so my point is that the proper way to see Venezuela and Iran is that Trump was deeply frustrated at home, unable to accomplish anything, and turning to foreign adventures to get the win that he psychologically needs, because that, is ultimately what's going on here. Yes, he had some kind of success in Venezuela, allegedly. I mean, agree on the theory um, that the new leadership is doing what he tells them, although we know that the prospect of the U.S. getting a lot of oil out of Venezuela is extremely unlikely. But um, that the attack on Iran, which I agree is going badly, and I think Trump will soon be forced to declare victory and go home, having successfully installed a more hardline leader in that country than the one that was there before. So that has to be understood as part of the weakness and the authoritarian project and the strength of the resistance to it. So I'll stop there.
Good, thanks, Fred. So look, as we sit and look forward to the midterm elections, we have to ask the question, certainly in Canada, people are asking about it. Can Trump be impeached? What can we do? How can we stop him? One subject hasn't come up is the Epstein file. What is it that we can do? We got from Bob, maybe Bob, you'd like to start by elaborating a bit on the Democracy in the Summer Project. The president of Wesleyan University, I believe, is behind that. And the universities have pretty well, with the exception of Harvard, just collapsed faced with Trump. So what can we expect in the form of opposition, people actually acting to do something about Trump?
Well, I think if you look at my generation, Fred's generation, Peggy's generation, the 60s, all of that stuff was led by students. And I think students have been somewhat quiescent. I think Minnesota activated students, and um, uh, Michael Roth, president of Wesleyan, has been out front since the very beginning of this, and he has organized other university presidents. And you've now got hundreds of universities. Interesting, it's the university administrations encouraging students to be part of this. And Harvard, in spite of itself, got tough. I mean, Harvard really wanted to cave in and settle with Trump the way Columbia did, but Trump kept upping the ante. And Harvard finally realized that you give in to blackmail, they just keep upping the terms. And that was also the result of alumni organizing and student organizing to force Garber, the president of Harvard, not to cave in. So you've got pushback from universities, you've got pushback from law firms, you've got pushback from all of these groups who thought they could have some kind of an entente with Trump, who realized that giving in to blackmail doesn't work. And I think the fact that students are going to be on the front lines once again is very encouraging. All of the signs are that this is going to be a so-called wave election, the way 2018 was. You remember in Trump won, the first Trump administration, women got organized almost immediately in January of 17. And you had the formation of groups like Indivisible and Run for Something. And despite the fact that Republicans controlled the machinery of the federal government, Democrats were able to flip 41 seats in the House of Representatives with Trump in control in Washington. And I think you're going to find something very, very similar. And the interesting thing about that election was that this was led by youth turning out in large numbers. Young people and poor people tend to vote in lower numbers than the rest of the population. But young people, people under 30, voted 2-1 for Democrats. They turned out in much higher numbers. And I think with young people activated, the same thing could very well happen this fall, in contrast to 2024, when there was a huge fall off of 7 or 8 million voters, many of whom would have voted for Democrats if they had voted. But the fact that Biden was too old, I mean, he ran a much better presidency than most people expected in terms of being something of a progressive rather than neoliberal. But that was mainly because of Elizabeth Warren. As I wrote at the time, you had the soul of Elizabeth Warren in the persona of Joe Biden, and it just didn't compute. And Biden took too long to step aside, and Kamala Harris was a terrible candidate. She was a terrible candidate when she ran in the primaries, and she didn't get any better as vice president. And so she just did not excite people. People didn't know what she stood for. And so there was a huge fall off relative to 2020 and relative to 2018. This time, Trump is not explicitly going to be on the ballot, but Trumpism is. And so it's going to be a kind of a referendum on Trump. And as the election draws closer, you're going to see more and more Republican incumbents being terrified and feeling that they need to break with Trump. Now, let me just second something Fred Block said, because I think this is very important. I've got a book coming out in 2 weeks. It's called Notes for Next Time. It's a personal and political memoir. And one of the things I say in that book is that assuming that the Republic survives and that we have a successful election in 2026, and even if the Democrats elect a president and a progressive president and a president with a working majority in Congress, that's when it gets really hard. Not just because of the fiscal hole, but because of the damage that Trump has done to the state, and even more so, the fact that all of the opportunities that my generation had have been undercut by 50 years of neoliberalism. So if you look at the things that make up the ability of ordinary people who don't have wealthy parents to give them a head start, to have a decent life, affordable college, affordable health care, careers that pay decent wages, affordable housing, pensions, the whole package, that is gone. And that was available to my generation. And as a kind of a frosting on the cake, we also had windfall housing wealth because
Right.
housing values increased faster than the rate of inflation. That's gone too. The ticket of admission into home ownership has become astronomical. And given the interplay of home ownership costs with student loan costs, the percentage of 35-year-olds and 40-year-olds who are homeowners is at a post-war low. Because if you're a young person with a college loan and you go to the bank and you apply for a mortgage and the loan officer says, oh, well, gee, you're paying $700 a month in student debt. You don't qualify for a mortgage. How you turn around all of this stuff without a more radical program than anything that's been seen in the United States since Franklin Roosevelt, that's a real challenge. And you would have to have a Democratic president with a working majority in Congress, far more radical than anything seen since FDR. So even if we have a successful election, even if the other aspects of democracy can be rebuilt, even if the government can rebuild, that's when it gets really hard.
Peggy, do you want to add to that? That sort of turn towards pessimism from Bob. I must say that the issue that strikes me so much is racism. When I was a student in the United States at Harvard in 1965 at the summer school, I discovered the issue of race in the United States and what it was. And when I saw Obama get elected, I thought, well, it looks like the original sin of the United States has been put behind them. Now we're going to have a society that's going to admit people as equals. And instead, we got a reaction. We got the sort of son of the Ku Klux Klan come back, and we now have open racism in the United States in a way that hasn't been there before. So what can we do about this kind of issue, Margaret?
Well, what we see in terms of this open racism at one level is standard American history. It's so easy to talk about backsliding from democracy, et cetera, forgetting that American democracy only has existed even in some proximate form since 1965, the Voting Rights Act. Meanwhile, starting in 2013, that very same Voting Rights Act has been systematically being dismantled. So that was it. The first thing that happened was the end of pre-clearance by the same Supreme Court. And by the way, in the year 2000, there was a little court decision called Bush v. Gore. And if there's this idealized notion that before Trump, we had a democratic polity, and yet in the year 2000, the Supreme Court essentially deprived the entire state of Florida from their votes by saying, sorry, you can't keep counting the votes. We get to decide, and they essentially installed Bush. It's easy to think about how different American history might have been if Al Gore had been justifiably allowed to become president in the year 2000. But going back to the Voting Rights Act, the year 2013, a big decision saying no more pre-clearance, meaning the southern, and not just southern states, plenty of states could do whatever the hell they wanted to, and they could get away with it because there was no longer going to be federal oversight. And there've been the Voting Rights Act has been chipped away at. And right this moment, any day now, any week now, we're going to find out the result of one of the most important Supreme Court cases being argued in the last 2 decades, I think, which is going to decide the constitutionality, in other words, whether it is constitutionally appropriate to have minority districts. In other words, 19 representatives in the House of Representatives are people of color who come from protected districts to make sure that it's mostly southern states, of course, where in a state like Alabama, where the population is something like 45%. I may have my state wrong. The case is Louisiana that's being argued. But you can have a Black population that's almost half the population. And because of gerrymandering, it can be diluted so much that there's not a single Black representative in the whole state. So the protected district makes sure that there is at least one African-American district. And that's why we have so many Black members of Congress in the House today. If that gets ruled unconstitutional, as it's almost inevitably going to be by this Supreme Court, that will mean automatically the loss of 19 Democratic seats, which essentially will give almost an insurmountable permanent Republican majority. Now, as Fred reminded me as I was talking to him about this the other day, it's unlikely this can be implemented before the midterms, because the midterms have already, so many states have started their primaries and have done all their districting, et cetera. But it will be immediately implemented after that. And essentially, that could mean the end of Black representation, African-American representation in Congress, except for a few handfuls here and there. That is a level of institutionalized racism, which is truly horrifying. And now if we look at what's going on culturally with racism and the elimination of Black history and the rewriting of history to normalize hierarchy, we can see that as a standard American backlash to Black progress. So everything that DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, all of the gains that it made, once again, in typical American history style, have met a backlash and have to be systematically undone. I want to call people's attention to the SAVE Act, SAVE, which is unclear whether it's going to pass. Unlikely it's going to pass unless the Republicans are willing to end the filibuster. The SAVE Act is a devastating form of disenfranchisement. Once again, primarily will have effect on people of color, but also women. Millions and millions of women will lose the right to vote if this act goes through, because your name on your birth certificate and your current name, it's so complicated, but basically any woman who has changed her name when she got married and cannot match her original name, the one that's on the birth certificate, to her current name, you have to go to court and get all of these documents. It costs hundreds of dollars. It's incredibly complicated. So essentially, misogyny will be instituted in a massive form of disenfranchisement. And another aspect of the SAVE Act that people are not aware of by and large. And by the way, this was completely voted 100%, I believe, on party lines and passed. So Republicans are for it, even the so-called moderate Republicans. There is a clause in it that essentially deputizes bounty hunters, right, just like in Texas, where normal citizens can have been deputized to name and turn in somebody that they suspect has committed an abortion and get that person, and they get a reward of tens of thousands of dollars in Texas if you turn in someone who's had an abortion or participated in abortion. The same thing is true with voting. It's deputizing bounty hunters to get a reward for snitching on and probably making up stories about neighbors, brown people, that they are convinced are illegal immigrants who are voting. And they get big rewards. The incentives, in other words, are massive. Let's assume that the SAVE Act doesn't pass. What's already happened is the end of what's called CISA, the Center for Bob, you probably know, I can't remember what the acronym stands for, but it's a major form of oversight using, in terms of computer messing up the elections through computer hacking and that sort of thing. The end of the civil rights, meaningful civil rights in the Department of Justice. Voters now being prosecuted. End of mail-in ballots. So many aspects that are in danger. Okay. I'll leave it that downside. Let me now try and say what I think what I see as some kind of possible hope. I am very intrigued by this notion of soft secession. And soft secession essentially is a way of saying, no, we're not going to have a civil war, but the blue states and there's no reason that blue states should be told what to do by a completely twisted government in which the voters of Wyoming have 350 times the power as the voters of California. Why should Californians be pushed around and told what to do by people in Wyoming and Louisiana? The program of soft secession suggests that blue states need to start practicing non-compliance with federal laws. It's a complicated process, but there are ways to do non-compliance that essentially resist the kind of federal autocratic practices that are now going on. And just as a reminder, blue states on average, I think, pay about $1.50 or $1.40 for every federal dollar, whereas red states pay about 75 cents for every dollar. And then California pays in all this money, and then the federal government says, no, you can't have disaster aid. You can't have FEMA funding. You can't have your welfare funding. You can't have the money you've already paid in. This should generate a kind of non-compliance and a form of generating alternative forms of revenue in the blue states to provide for the kind of social safety nets that the feds are taking away to support food stamps, to support Medicaid, et cetera. There should be movements for public banking, for municipal broadband, and public utilities. Here in Ann Arbor, Michigan, we're so sick of DTE. There is a move to try and get municipal energy and electricity. And the third aspect of this soft secession is there should be prosecution allowed for federal officials. Right now, citizens are only allowed to sue state and local officials for violating their constitutional rights. And historically, this is because in the era of the civil rights movement, it was the feds that were coming in and imposing egalitarian policies such as desegregation, et cetera, against the fascist, racist practices of the southern states and who were using states' rights. Today, the whole thing is flipped, and it's time that federal officials be subject to the kind of immunization that we have given them. And there are actually several laws right now in Congress. One is called the Bivens Act. There's another one, I won't go into the name, but this would be a kind of EU model of federalism. Mondami represents a kind of soft secession, after all. He's playing it very, very well. So that is this, I'm just skimming the surface, but non-compliance of blue states is really something that I think needs to be on the agenda.
Thanks, Peggy. Fred, what kind of things could we look for to make things happen in the U.S.?
Yeah, I don't agree with my distinguished colleague on the soft succession. That it seems to me that it's counter to what is actually potential to build an opposition movement across the 50 states. The first thing I was going to say is that one of the things to do is to protest, and that there's another big No Kings demonstration that's scheduled for March 18th. The organizers have talked about 10 million people participating all across the country. And that's extremely important, especially if the war is continuing. It will then be a No Kings, No War protest. And again, a very large turnout will further make the point about the narrowness of Trump's base. The second thing I would stress as a sign of hope is precisely the shift that is taking place within the Democratic Party. That obviously that there's still, the ongoing division between the centrists and the left that's been, going on since the Bernie Sanders first campaign, but that there has been a very marked strengthening of the left, represented by Mandani's election in New York City, but that in this primary in Texas that was just completed, the young man, he's like 35 years old, Tallarico, he essentially gave his victory speech, and the first words out of his mouth were, "We have to go after the billionaires. We have to," and he ended with talking about Jesus overturning the tables in the temple and said, "It's time that we start flipping some tables." So, invoking this Christian imagery, this revolutionary Christian imagery, going after the moneylenders, the financiers, the billionaires, essentially opens up the possibility of a revival of a kind of left populism that has a real history across the South. And so what I would suggest, kind of counter to Peggy's soft succession, is that it is true that Trump's base and the deep appeals are, as some people have called it, a kind of neo-Confederate movement, that the hostility to Black people, et cetera, is rooted in the values of the old Confederacy. But if we look at the map, the Democrats have already picked off Virginia. It's now a reliably blue state. Georgia has elected 2 Democrats to the Senate. The gubernatorial race is likely to be close this time. And so we have the possibility now of the Democrat winning a Senate race in Texas. Now, if it's true that Democrats have been fantasizing about winning a statewide race in Texas for 30 years and have not succeeded yet, but essentially, the possibility is to break apart the solid South, and in that case, the electoral map of the country starts to look quite different. I guess I agree with Bob that the challenge, if the Democrats were to regain power in 2028, is enormous. But it it also, one of the ways of thinking about it is that Trump has successfully destroyed the centrist consensus of the Cold War years. And one sees this, that the Democratic Party is now, the dominant position in the Democratic Party is highly critical of Israel, that the kind of tight fit between the Democratic Party and support for Israel has been broken. That one can see the possibility of the party actually. I mean, and again, I acknowledge it's a long shot, but that there is a possibility of forging a coalition that mobilizes Black and brown people who flirted with Trumpism and have now, as we've seen in several elections, moved back away from Trump in response to the deportation campaign. We can see the outline of what the late Jesse Jackson talked about as a rainbow coalition of the progressive whites allied with people of color, creating a Democratic Party that is Rooseveltian in its vision of the kind of transformation. And the last part of that is that what Trump has made possible is that something which has not been a part of American politics since before World War II is he's put on the agenda the retreat from empire, that it is possible that within the Democratic Party, people will start to say, let's start cutting back the size of the Pentagon. Let's start pulling back those bases abroad. Let's build our security on cooperation with allies rather than on dominance. That possibility of a retreat from empire opens up the possibility for kinds of domestic reform that have not been conceivable during the entire post-World War II period.
Well, thanks, Fred. Well, the third sort of question is, what do we expect and we certainly have issues on the agenda, the war perhaps overshadowing the others. Epstein, which is sitting there waiting to finish Trump off. I sort of think of Trump's success as being based on his normalization in the media as a normal person, and the report a lie, he says, as news rather than identifying it as a lie. And without a sort of shift in public opinion, it seems that he'll be able to get away with quite a bit right up into the in midterm elections. But these issues, the war in particular, the Epstein file, perhaps you have others to identify, are obviously going to play an important part of what we're going to see going forward. Bob, do you want to start and talk about what we might expect in the next while from the Trump presidency?
Yeah, let me start with the war. I mean, the war epitomizes Trump's recklessness. As everybody knows, every time he opens his mouth, he's got a different rationale for the war. And he's at the point where he's either going to have to declare victory and go home fairly soon and leave the Islamist regime in place, which is not a victory in the sense that it is going to lead great instability in the region for a long time, even though he's obviously weakened their capacity, their nuclear capacity, or he can have a prolonged war. But they've shown that they can persist, that this is a layered regime where the strength of the regime is not just in the top few people, but it's at every level of government in Iran. So he's either way, it's a quagmire. I mean, either the political situation in the aftermath of a quick war is not what he wanted, or it's a prolonged war, and whichever it turns out to be, um, uh, he didn't gain the political victory he hoped for. It's also done a huge amount of collateral damage economically, which
Right.
gives the lie to Trump's claim that the economy is great and things are affordable. I mean, if you, I did a piece just on this the other day for the Prospect. I mean, for starters, you had unemployment ticking up in Friday's report, even before the impact of the war. The war is going to cause unemployment to tick up even more. You had inflation ticking up even before the war. Inflation's going to get worse. And all of this is on Trump because of his cuts to direct federal employment, his freezes on research funding, the cost of his tariffs, the reversal of Biden's industrial policies. All of this cost jobs. And then you've got the real risk of a financial meltdown because Trump has promoted so much speculation in crypto, in AI, in the deregulation of finance, where so much of the inflated stock market is a result of borrowed money. And once you get a kind of a fall in stock values, that feeds on itself. And the war only exacerbates that because of the effects on oil. and other supply chain inputs. So he's got a military mess, he's got an economic mess, and all of this, I think, weakens him politically because it makes him less popular. It also makes Republicans even more inclined to put some distance between themselves and Trump, which then weakens him further. And then, of course, you have Epstein, where the other shoe still hasn't dropped, where by refusing to divulge everything that's there, they only keep the Epstein issue in the headlines week after week after week. And more people suspect that there's horrible stuff that directly implicates Trump. And so that keeps the Epstein issue alive week after week after week. So none of this is good for Trump. And, you worry that he's going to do something even crazier, but I'm not sure what that is. I mean, there's a Randy Newman song that some of us are old enough to remember. No one likes us, let's drop the big one. And I think if Trump gets crazy enough, he might want to start World War III. That's sort of in my darkest moments. If he hasn't started World War III already, that's what I imagine. People don't appreciate me, so I might as well blow up the world. He's not quite there yet. I don't think he will be there. I think the constraints are starting to kick in. Maybe that's too optimistic, but just about everything that he's tried to do is backfiring on him.
Okay, thanks, Bob. I'll go to Fred now. Fred, what can we expect from the this Trump presidency?
Well, I agree with Bob that I don't see that Trump has any rabbits to pull out of the hat that are going to make him and the Republicans more popular by the time we get to the election. It seems to me that the economy is headed towards deeper trouble. The AI boom is, it seems to me, very likely to turn into a bubble that breaks because the firms are spending, the key firms are spending tens and hundreds of billions of dollars on building these data centers and so forth. And the immediate cash return, from selling their AI bots and so forth, can't possibly justify the level of expenditure that they're laying out. So um, it is plausible that the whole thing will come crashing down. But just the ordinary circumstances, we know that the big beautiful bill had disastrous consequences for healthcare. There are more and more people who are being um, priced out of the healthcare market. Rural hospitals are across the country are closing because they're dependent upon Medicare payments, which are being cut back. So one of the factoids which wasn't hasn't been mentioned, but is that there was a state legislative seat in Texas that was open, and the Democrat won in that race. And I think the idea was that Trump had won that seat by 17 points. The Democrat won the seat by 14 points. So it was a 31-point swing in that district, which suggests, a kind of complete. I mean, if that happens in other districts, it's an upheaval that would just decimate the Republican Party. So, and again, um, one of the core facets of the Trump phenomenon is that in all three of his races, he carried almost every rural county in the country by 80 to 20. And that proved critical in states like Pennsylvania, where there are a lot of rural counties, then they add up. and ultimately offset the 80-20, offset the 70-30 Democratic victory in cities like Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. So if the Democrats are able to mobilize discontent in those rural counties to the point where Republicans are winning only by 60-40, that has huge electoral consequences. And again, points to a real disruption of the Republican political base.
Thanks, Fred. Peggy, what kind of things do you expect out of the Trump presidency?
Well, let me just pick up a few points at random. One is I hope Fred is right about the end of empire, but the signs from the Democratic Party so far are kind of disappointing in the sense that what their complaint about the war so far has barely been about the war itself and has almost entirely been focused on proceduralism. The fact that they didn't get the vote, to be able to vote on this war. The War Powers Act, which of course has been ignored for 50 years. But if they would get off of the proceduralism and more on the content, the substance of what this war is about. But they always frame it just like they did in Venezuela by saying, oh my God, we're so happy to get rid of this vile dictatorship. We're so happy to get rid of this vile Maduro. And of course, these are both vile regimes, and we are happy to get rid of them. But that's not how you stage an opposition, is by saying how the end was worth it implicitly. So that worries me about the end of empire. The thing that has not been mentioned at all in this entire discussion is the oligarchical takeover of the media. It's absolutely cannot be overstated just how dramatic it is that it's not just Fox News now that is giving information to the American people, but it is now CBS. It's going to be CNN. It's going to be whoever else is Discovery Network, whatever else is in that stratosphere of this new Paramount takeover of Warner. It is really, just as an example, at this so-called, where they return the bodies of the fallen soldiers to the Dover airport base yesterday, and Trump refused to take off his baseball cap that said something like "Make America Great Again," and refused to bow his head. Fox News played an old alternative video of of something in the past where Trump had taken his hat off, so that people would not be forced to see Trump showing such complete lack of respect for the people that he had killed. Now, if it gets through that Trump actually said, if it gets through to the American people, that Trump actually said basically like, whatever, people die in war, what's the big deal? It's all worth it. Over and over again, yeah, whatever, people will die. The problem is that in an oligarchical media environment, there's now very few outlets for people to find out what's really going on. Now, granted that Fox News thing didn't work because we all found out it was a sham. So you can say, well, it didn't work. But it does work a lot of the time. And we know that the whole idea of the factual universe is incredibly dicey and can be moved and viewed in different ways. The other thing about the Epstein class that's worth pointing out, it's not just Trump being protected by the DOJ against his undoubtedly rape and abuse of women. It is the whole concept of a class of Epstein oligarchs that runs from, sorry, Noam Chomsky, to Deepak Chopra, whatever that guy's name is, to Larry Summers, to the to the Democrat who worked in I think the Obama DOJ. It's this is the normal neoliberal state at its finest, and it's not clear that we're going to find out everything in very soon about the truth about the Trump implications in the Epstein saga. What I do have optimism about is a couple of things. I am thrilled with the artistic cultural refusal that we see, to the refusal to participate in rewriting the sort of moral narrative of the nation. And you see that in the Kennedy Center having to close because so many artists and cultural groups have just said, no, F you, we're not coming. That is wonderful because autocratic power needs cultural institutions to dictate a sense of national identity and to decide who gets to count as a person of worth. So this is fantastic form of resistance. Obviously, Minneapolis, it wasn't just protest, it was an entire underground railroad, which was essentially created, in which white people in Minneapolis risked their lives, even after Renee Good and Preddy were murdered, to protect people in their basements, to move them through from house to house. It was a true underground system, which is absolutely exhilarating. And so we can hope for more of that and this level of solidarity across race and, yes, across all the states. And I do take solace in this democratic summer that is being planned, that Bob has written about. As far as what we can expect from Trump, I do expect that we're going to see ICE at the polls, and that it is going to create a massive fear and intimidation of showing up for many, many people. I think that's going to have real impact. And I do understand that the Republicans are planning another round of budget cuts and tax cuts, because that's the only kind of policy they can get through, because it's passed through something called reconciliation. So they don't need to worry about the filibuster. So there are more Republicans than there are Democrats, and they can pass these budget cuts in the name of tax cuts that appear to be helping regular people, such as tax breaks on tip, like no taxing if you're a tipped worker, which makes people say, oh, wonderful, they're looking out for, the common person. It'll be a sham, but it is something that is on the table.
Bob, did you want to add something?
No, I think we've had a very good conversation, and I think we can probably let it go here. Thank you.
Fred, last word?
No, I'm done.
Well, listen, I want to thank our panelists. I first encountered Bob Kuttner in the Atlantic Monthly, and article he wrote, The Problem of Economics, in 1984. And I clipped it into a file I called Important Articles, and I made every student I had after read it. It was a wonderful piece of work.
Thank you.
Fred wrote a piece on productivity. If it's not the best piece in political science, sort of social science research that I've read, it's certainly amongst the very best and very revealing. And Peggy, of course, has shown her brilliance in all her work. So it's really a great pleasure for the Polanyi Institute to be able to welcome these distinguished friends of the Polanyi Institute, scholars who discovered Polanyi on their own. Peggy did in her 20s, Fred did as well, all by themselves. They recognized it. And the great contribution of the Polanyi Institute is to bring together these students of Polanyi who didn't really know each other and to create a network. I remember when Carrie told me she was setting up an institute for her father's files, and she wanted just people to have access to the archives. And she said to me, and you know what? I found a graduate student who speaks Hungarian, and I don't speak Hungarian. I have German. So I found this graduate student. And this graduate student is Margie Mindell, who's been and become the spirit, the leader of the Polanyi Institute. And Margie, thank you so much for all you do, all you've done, for putting this panel together, bringing this issue of the American presidency, which affects everyone in the world, to put the spotlight on it. The Polanyi Institute is the one doing it, not the University of Toronto or McGill or any of the other places that should be doing it. So thanks to everybody who checked in. If you were in Vienna, if you were in where there's a Polanyi Institute, or if you're in South Korea, where we have Polanyi scholars, in Canada and the United States. Thanks so much, everyone, for tuning in, and thanks again for a wonderful conversation. We'll just do this again for sure. Thanks so much.
My turn to thank you, Duncan. Thank you for your excellent moderation. This is, I think, the third or fourth time that you've done this, and you're in. I mean, you're all four of you are locked into being invited to do this again, certainly before the primaries. I found this conversation, like the previous ones, so informative, so insightful, and we recorded it, and it'll be available on the Polanyi Institute YouTube channel. But it is such a contrast. I mean, you raised, Peggy, what's happening now to the media, but even before it actually happens, it's such a contrast to what we listen to, the bombardment that we get daily. That yes, there are a lot of facts, and we are assaulted by these facts every day. But the analysis is really lacking, and this is what we heard today from the three of you. Bob, I look forward to your book very, very much. And I'll just make a pitch here for the American Prospect, which for me is really almost a daily source of good analysis, excellent writing, pithy, interesting, and superb, and in many ways, in contrast to a lot of what we have access to, even in very good American journalism. So thank you all, and please stay tuned. You will be invited back, and we are in solidarity with you. We watch. We're only, in my case, 45 minutes from the American border, and every day is another assault. We began by saying, I haven't heard the news today, and heaven knows what Fred's introductory comment was very apropos, that this is we need a team of social psychologists to try to unpack what is really a devastating time in American history, in world history. Thank you all, and thank you everybody who attended. And have a good day, good evening, good morning. Until the next time. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.